An underlying shift is reorganizing the geography of survival in the United Kingdom, occurring not in the depressed post-industrial towns of the north, but within the most affluent postal codes of the south. Along the tree-lined million-pound avenues of Bristol and the peripheral arteries of London, an unfamiliar landscape has quietly established itself. Hundreds of weathered, windowless commercial vehicles, decommissioned transit vans, and decades-old caravans are now permanently parked bumper to bumper. This is not the manifestation of a curated, minimalist lifestyle trend popular on social media, nor is it a temporary gathering of holidaymakers. It is a highly structured, desperate response to an unprecedented housing deficit. Estimates suggest that between 30,000 and 180,000 individuals across England have converted vehicle cabins into their primary residences. This phenomenon represents the emergence of mobile, mechanized slums, operating as the final line of defense for a population entirely decoupled from the conventional housing market. The existence of these metallic encampments alongside some of the most expensive real estate in Europe exposes a fundamental fracture in the state's economic framework. It raises a sobering question: what does macroeconomic scale mean when a significant segment of the domestic workforce is structurally excluded from renting a basic brick-and-mortar room? Historically, the British housing market maintained a predictable baseline. For decades, the working-class and lower-middle-class populations relied on a predictable equilibrium of private tenancies, a functional social housing stock, and a local welfare safety net designed to absorb sudden economic shocks. If an individual worked a standard 40-hour week, the system guaranteed at minimum a secure tenancy, even within major urban centers. Housing was understood not as a volatile speculative asset but as a foundational utility. This stability has vanished. The baseline of a secure roof in exchange for full-time labor has been replaced by an aggressive market dynamic that treats shelter as a luxury commodity, leaving an expanding portion of the population completely exposed. The evidence of this transition is visible along the roadsides, where the physical indicators of domestic life have been compressed into the public right-of-way. On the ground, observations across 107 spontaneous parking zones in Bristol, ranging from the affluent perimeter of Clifton Downs to derelict industrial estates, reveal an environment defined by what is missing. There are no external utility connections, no municipal waste receptacles allocated for these units, and no formal addresses. Front windshields are obscured not by sunshades, but by heavy improvised insulation to retain heat, instead of the polished, wood-paneled interiors of recreational vehicles. These cabins are congested with basic survival gear, industrial water containers, portable gas rings, and layers of damp clothing. Local accounts collected from these vehicular corridors paint a picture far removed from choice. The vast majority of residents describe their living conditions as a daily exercise in spatial confinement and institutional invisibility, where the constant threat of vehicular towing replaces the traditional eviction notice. Passersby commute to high-value corporate offices, walking directly past rows of diesel engines that double as bedrooms, treating the structural crisis as a mere aesthetic inconvenience. When municipal enforcement teams attach removal directives to these vehicle windows, the objective is clear. It is an attempt to physically displace a community that the administrative state refuses to acknowledge. This sudden displacement is directly tied to a severe economic squeeze. Data from the 2024-2025 period shows that private rental fees across major English metropolitan areas escalated by 10% to 18% within a single 12-month cycle. Simultaneously, real wages experienced severe contraction due to sustained inflationary pressure. The traditional relationship between labor and housing security has broken down completely. An analysis by the housing organization Crisis reveals that up to 70% of individuals currently experiencing this form of homelessness are actively employed. These are full-time workers, frequently logging 60 hours a week across retail, logistics, and healthcare sectors, who have been systematically priced out of the very market they serve. When private landlords initiate renovations to maximize yield, tenants are displaced into a market where energy costs have surged by up to 300% over a 3-year trajectory. Annual council taxes impose an unsustainable financial burden. The structural architecture of this crisis is rooted in 40 years of deliberate policy decisions. The systemic depletion of social housing stock, initiated by the aggressive privatization campaigns of the 1980s, has left municipal authorities with virtually no fallback options. Current waiting lists for council housing extend up to 10 years in competitive districts, rendering the option entirely obsolete for those facing immediate displacement. For 80% of citizens under the age of 40, property ownership has shifted from a difficult milestone to a mathematical impossibility. Trapped in a cycle of high rents and reliant on high-interest consumer credit to bridge the gap between stagnant wages and soaring living costs, these individuals possess zero financial resilience. A single rent increase or a standard no-fault eviction notice is sufficient to push a fully employed taxpayer out of the formal property market permanently. When bricks and mortar become unattainable, the currency of the modern state, the fixed address, loses its utility, initiating a secondary process of systemic erasure. In an administrative system designed entirely around physical geography, the loss of a postal code signifies the immediate loss of civic existence. Without a verifiable address, an individual is effectively barred from registering with a local general practitioner, maintaining a standard bank account to receive legal wages, or enrolling children in neighborhood schools. The state apparatus does not see citizens, it sees data anomalies. This address trap locks tens of thousands into a hidden tier of homelessness, where their health deteriorates twice as fast as the general population due to chronic dampness and cold, where 40% struggle with unmanaged severe anxiety and clinical depression. The state's response to this crisis has not been structural reinvestment, but a calculated administrative pruning, allowing the invisible population to grow as long as they remain on the move. The social safety net, originally designed to catch those falling from economic stability, has been systematically dismantled, leaving the most vulnerable to sink directly to the bottom of an indifferent system, hidden behind the rusty metal panels of roadside trucks. This institutional failure is not accidental, it is the logical conclusion of a market that prioritizes asset values over human survival. While the macro-level metrics expose the numerical scale of this displacement, the true mechanics of this reversal become legible only when examining the specific policy failures that have accelerated the crisis. The state's fiscal allocation reveals that this structural breakdown is not a consequence of absolute resource scarcity, but of a profound systemic misallocation. Rather than investing capital into the construction of permanent municipal social housing, a practice largely abandoned after the legislative shifts of the late 20th century, the state has engineered an expensive, temporary patchwork system. Central government decisions froze the local housing allowance between 2020 and 2024, a critical period during which private rental fees spiked to historic highs. This freeze created a severe deficit, leaving the state housing subsidy covering less than 30% of the actual market rate for a standard apartment. This deliberate decoupling of state support from market reality left low-income, working households with an unsustainable deficit, turning the welfare safety net into an ineffective mechanism that actively forces individuals out of traditional tenancies to manage the resulting influx of displaced citizens. Local authorities have diverted millions of pounds annually away from infrastructure and directly into the private sector, specifically targeting budget bed and breakfast hotels. Across England, municipal councils regularly pay between £150 and £200 per night to secure a single cramped room for a homeless family. This short-term containment strategy operates at a cost that far exceeds the capital required to build permanent, high-quality social dwellings. It represents an ongoing transfer of public funds into the hands of private hospitality operators who profit directly from the structural failure of the housing market. Inside the local government offices tasked with managing this crisis, the institutional paralysis is total. Approximately 85% of municipal housing officers report operating with depleted budgets and inadequate administrative tools. The automated software systems utilized to assess and distribute emergency financial aid are structurally incapable of processing non-traditional living arrangements. The field requiring a fixed postal address cannot be bypassed. Consequently, an individual residing in a vehicle is automatically disqualified from receiving state benefits due to a software limitation. This is a process of administrative erasure, where the bureaucracy systematically disconnects the displaced population from the very resources designed to assist them, leaving them with no choice but to remain on the absolute periphery of the urban landscape. When the administrative apparatus fails to resolve the crisis through policy, the state shifts its strategy from management to enforcement, using the legal framework to criminalize the symptoms of economic exclusion. The passage of the Police, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Act 2022 marked a critical escalation in this approach. Under this legislation, unauthorized encampments and vehicular parking on public or private land, previously classified as civil trespass, were elevated to criminal offenses. Individuals residing in vehicles now face the immediate threat of a 3-month prison sentence or a severe criminal fine. In Bristol alone, municipal authorities executed more than 50 large-scale roadside evictions over the course of 2025. These operations typically commence at 5 a.m., utilizing specialized enforcement teams and heavy machinery to clear entire avenues of inhabited vehicles before the surrounding high-value residential areas awaken. The application of these legal measures reveals a stark class divide in the enforcement of public order. While an affluent motorist parking illegally incurs a standard municipal penalty notice, a working-class individual utilizing a vehicle as a primary dwelling faces the permanent destruction of their asset. When an inhabited vehicle is impounded during a municipal sweep, the owner is required to provide upwards of £1,000 in recovery fees to reclaim it. For a population already completely severed from the financial system, this sum is unattainable. Consequently, the vehicle, along containing all personal belongings, documents, and clothing, is routinely transferred directly to commercial crushing facilities to be destroyed. Millions of pounds of public tax revenue are directed annually into funding these police operations, legal fees, and vehicle disposal contracts, while zero municipal funds are allocated toward establishing secure, serviced parking sites where vehicular residents could access basic sanitation. This strategy is driven in large part by organized resident groups operating under the principle of protecting local property values, with 75% of formal complaints focusing strictly on visual blight and parking congestion. The legal framework protects the aesthetic integrity of high-value public land while offers zero protection to the citizens occupying it, transforming public policy into a mechanism that hunts the displaced from one municipal border to the next. Faced with this sustained institutional hostility, the population residing within these mobile slums has been forced to develop an autonomous, alternative infrastructure to guarantee basic survival. In the dense vehicular settlements, where the ambient temperature inside an uninsulated truck cabin drops below freezing during the winter months, survival depends entirely on mutual aid networks rather than state intervention. Data gathered from these roadside communities indicates that up to 80% of vehicle residents actively share off-grid solar power arrays and communal battery charging setups with neighboring units. The daily collection of water, the distribution of bottled gas, and the maintenance of shared cooking facilities have been formalized into a highly disciplined, non-market economy. Individuals within these networks have developed specialized skills, functioning as self-taught mechanics, electricians, and legal advisors who train newcomers on how to fortify vehicles against the weather, repair complex electrical faults, and navigate the specific legal loopholes used by enforcement teams during surprise evictions. This collective organization has produced a distinct social structure born out of necessity. Mental health assessments within these clusters show that 60% of residents credit the internal support network as the primary factor preventing complete psychological collapse. The community systematically self-regulates, reserving the safest, most accessible parking spaces for families traveling with young children, and establishing internal waste management routines to minimize friction with local resident groups. This is not a romanticized subculture of choice, but an involuntary reorganization of human labor and solidarity occurring precisely where the traditional state structure has abdicated its responsibilities. These individuals do not seek municipal charity. They require structural recognition. Their ability to maintain stable, cooperative communities under conditions of extreme economic precarity serves as a direct indictment of an economic system that values urban real estate speculation far above the preservation of human life. Yet, as the gap between corporate real estate valuations and the cost of basic survival continues to widen, the pressure on these fragile, self-made sanctuaries is reaching a critical threshold that the current framework cannot sustain. Behind these statistics are real lives being reshaped, compressed into a few square meters of steel and plywood along the curbsides of a fracturing nation. The human dimension of this crisis is defined not by sudden spectacular catastrophes, but by a slow, wearing attrition that erodes the boundary between working-class respectability and total destitution. Consider the daily routine of a delivery driver or a night shift healthcare assistant, individuals who spend their days keeping the infrastructure of major English cities running, only to return to a rusted transit van parked under the shadow of a luxury residential development. Inside these metal shells, the sensory indicators of a traditional home are entirely absent. There is no sound of running water, no reliable warmth from a central heating unit, and no security of tenure. Instead, existence is dictated by the hum of portable generators, the smell of damp insulation, and the constant, low-frequency anxiety of an early morning knock from a municipal enforcement team. The transition from a standard apartment to a vehicular cabin follows a remarkably uniform trajectory. For many families, the process begins with a standard no-fault eviction notice issued under Section 21 of the Housing Act, a legislative mechanism that permits landlords to reclaim property without demonstrating tenant fault. In an hyper-inflated private rental market where a single room in a shared house routinely consumes more than half of a worker's net income, thus a loss of a tenancy is frequently a terminal event. With social housing waiting lists frozen in amber and local authority emergency accommodation restricted to unsafe, vice-ridden private bed-and-breakfast hotels, the purchase of a second-hand commercial vehicle becomes a calculated decision to maintain some semblance of autonomy. Yet, the reality inside these mobile fortresses is a stark contradiction to any notion of independence. Families with young children find themselves navigating an environment where the most basic acts of human dignity, showering before a shift, preparing a hot meal, or drying school uniforms, require complex logistics, relying on gym memberships, public amenities, and the goodwill of neighboring vehicle dwellers. The psychological toll of this existence is profound, yet completely ignored by mainstream commentary that prefers to focus on visible rough sleeping. For the hidden homeless population inside the vans, the primary burden is the enforcement of structural invisibility. Parents go to extreme lengths to conceal their living arrangements from employers and schools, fearful that the disclosure of their lack of a fixed address will trigger child protection interventions or immediate dismissal. Children learn to do their homework by the dim light of battery-powered lanterns, instructed to remain silent when footsteps pass close to the exterior panels of the vehicle. This forced secrecy creates a profound sense of isolation, a feeling of being physically present within a community while being completely erased from its civic fabric. The local state apparatus treats these individuals not as vulnerable citizens in need of structural support, but as mobile public nuisances to be perpetually displaced. The police monitor their movements through automatic number plate recognition networks, tracking them as fluid administrative problems rather than human beings seeking refuge from an unlivable housing market. This constant displacement ensures that the domestic life of the vehicle resident is characterized by permanent transience. A vehicle cannot become a home when the local authority can mandate its destruction within 24 hours. When an enforcement sweep occurs, it does not merely clear a public road, it dismantles a complex ecosystem of mutual survival. The loss of a vehicle means the loss of every personal keepsake, every piece of documentation, and the only barrier protecting an individual from the raw elements of an English winter. The emotional weight of this precarity manifests in the high rates of chronic stress and clinical depression recorded across these settlements. It is a quiet, systemic violence that doesn't make the evening headlines, but is legible in the strained faces of workers who clock into their shifts every morning after a night spent listening to the rain hit a corrugated iron roof, wondering if their home will still be parked in the same location when they return. The crisis of vehicular homelessness brings the trajectory of modern Britain full circle, exposing the stark reality of its economic model. A nation that historically pioneered global industrialization and constructed an expansive post-war welfare state now presides over an urban landscape, where full-time employment no longer guarantees the most elemental human requirement, stable, stationary shelter. The million-pound streets of Bristol and London, with their pristine facades and soaring real estate valuations, do not represent a sustainable wealth, but an extractive economy that consumes its own workforce. The spontaneous metal slums lining the avenues are not an aberration. They are the necessary byproduct of a system that has successfully transformed a basic human right into an elite financial asset. As the night deepens, the glowing screens of smartphones inside hundreds of dark, unheated vehicle cabins illuminate a population that has been systematically pruned from the modern state, left to float as invisible ghosts in the margins of a society that values the ground they park on far more than the lives they are trying to salve.